I was expected to not know anything about sex or physicality until it was time for me to get married, which that point was defined as after I was engaged to a man and had a wedding date. That was when I would receive sex ed. And there was a special woman appointed to do that. She was a bride teacher. I went to her apartment in Brooklyn into like this back room that was her husband's study. And in that room, she taught me everything about what I should expect out of the physical part of my marriage and showed me how like the stick on that douche would be like the shape of his private part and that it would go up and get erect and go into my vagina. I remember just being sick. I wish someone had told me. My wedding was 2 days away at that point, and it almost felt a little bit intentional that I didn't get that information until 48 hours before. I was prepared to give my body to God, but I wasn't prepared to give up everything that made me me.
Hey, my name is Shalise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening, join us over on YouTube, where you can see our faces at Cults to Consciousness, and we would love it if you could like, subscribe, all the YouTubey things. I know it's kind of annoying, but it really does make a huge difference for our videos. It helps more people see it, helps more people become understanding and supportive of these guests who are coming on and sharing their stories. And of course, they do read the comments, so it means a lot to them as well. Today's guest, she was sent to us, referred to us by Beatrice, who you know and love. And I'm really excited to get deeper into the topic of Hasidicism or Ultra Orthodox communities. Today, we're talking to a woman who wrote this book, Kissing Girls on Shabbat. It's incredible, highly recommend, such a great read. Really illustrates within a lot of different vignettes what her life was like growing up and having those feelings of wanting to be with women instead of men, being forced into this kind of lifestyle that was prescribed for her. And we're going to talk deeply about what it was like in that community, having to deal with the different rules around sex and intimacy and even childbirth and pregnancy. So, such an important episode today. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Sara Glass.
Thank you for having me. I
Yes.
really appreciate your podcast and the work that you do to educate people on the things that are often kept underground. I think it's so important to put everything out in the open so that we can deal with it.
Yeah, thank you. And I feel like, I mean, I couldn't do this without you sharing your story because I'm learning too, along with the viewers, about the inner workings of all these different groups. And so by you being so willing to be vulnerable and share is such a huge deal. And as I was reading your book, I was telling you off camera, I was really excited that you were willing to write down some of these more private and vulnerable things that are
Yeah.
often unspoken, especially among women, that I think it really affects so many women in these high control groups, the control on their sexuality and their reproductive systems and how they are basically used as, oh my gosh, one of your quotes was, I was a vagina who could cook. And that stuck
Yeah.
out to me like bold words on the paper. I was like,
Uh,
wow, I need to write that down
yeah.
because that perfectly illustrates how you felt and how you were being treated essentially.
Yes.
Yes. So let's get into it. I want to start kind of in chronological order as you did in your book. Unless there's anything from your childhood that you wanted to specifically mention, you start off your book talking about when you're a teenager and you fall in love with a girl.
Yes. Oh, am I getting chills thinking about it now? Just like the way it's all being put out in the open. So I was raised in Hasidic Brooklyn, which pretty much looks like 18th century Europe. It's like, the men in full garb, like the fur hats, the long black coats, women in wigs and long dresses. And it's a community that's like intentionally kept in these sort of like dark age looks to separate them from the outside world. And so I was supposed to get married, right? Like married to a boy. I was supposed to go to an all girls school, and then like a boy would be chosen for me from the school a few blocks away, and I would just marry him when I was old enough, which was 18 or 19. But I just kept falling in love with girls. And so that complicated things for me. And the
Right.
book begins at 19, like when I'm like 19 years old, trying to get married, but also madly in love with this other religious girl.
Something that I hadn't really considered that you point out in the book is that you're having these feelings for this woman and you really have this deep relationship with her, but now you're engaged to a man and you're like, okay, but what is really a sin? What is the sin here? Is it that I am with a girl, or is it that I'm essentially cheating on the woman that I love with a man? And I think that that was such a great point because so often in religious communities, it's so black and white. It's just you have a male and a female, you get married, you have kids, and anything outside of that is considered a sin. But when you really look into the complexity and the emotions of a human to a human, and where those boundaries kind of intersect within just being a human being and having romantic feelings. I thought that was a really interesting perspective that I'm glad you brought up.
Yeah, it was kind of, I think, where I started to see some hypocrisy because I was raised to believe that the God we had was benevolent and kind and loving. And then I had like my secret girlfriend watch me date this man. And I saw the pain in her eyes and I saw how hard it was for her. I had blocked out how hard it was for me, but I would come home from these dates and she would be shaking and crying. And I thought, does God really want me to ignore her?
Mhm.
Is that the God I was raised with? That like now that I'm supposed to be getting married, am I supposed to just let her be in pain? And I thought I was. Like, ultimately, I decided that's what God did want, which is heartbreaking.
Right. It brings up a whole other set of issues with how are you going to feel about a God who wants you or someone else to suffer. And I just want to take this moment really quick. Anyone who's watching who may have their own opinions, you can, of course, believe whatever feels right to you about two women being together. But I
Yeah.
just hope that everyone who listens to this interview listens with an open mind and an open heart and recognizing humanity instead of trying to put your own biases or what you think is the correct way according to your religion, because I think everyone would just do so much better if we could see each other from human to human instead of our own ideas of what we think should be correct.
Yeah, I've been really surprised since the book has come out at people from all religions, so many religious backgrounds have said, I relate, I can understand. Whether or not they're queer identified, I've just said, like, I feel your pain. And I do feel like if you read the book, you'll see that I'm not negative or judgmental necessarily toward the community as a whole. And I hope that does help you keep an open heart.
Definitely. I want to talk about the expectations placed on you. And I know you've mentioned that you don't even necessarily blame the man that you were made to marry for the way that he treated you and the circumstances because it's all so controlled and conditioned and programmed to be a certain way. So let's talk about those boundaries a little bit. What were your expectations as a young 19-year-old girl, and how did you want to escape those boundaries?
It might make sense to talk a little bit about the bridal classes that I received
Yeah.
in terms of expectations and what his groom classes were like. So I was expected to not know anything about sex or physicality until it was time for me to get married, which that point was defined as after I was engaged to a man and had a wedding date. That was when I would receive sex ed. And there was a special woman appointed to do that. She was a bride teacher. I went to her like apartment in Brooklyn into like this back room that was her husband's study. And in that room, she taught me everything about what I should expect out of the physical part of my marriage. And of course, there was a lot of preamble about how this is the holiest thing you can do. You're joining with God in the moment that you join with your husband. This is how you create holy children. But when I learned about the mechanics of what the act would entail, I was completely shocked. I was in her apartment and I remember like her taking out this tube of toothpaste and it was rolled up at the bottom and there were stickers on the cap that were supposed to look like a face, like a smile face or something. And then she had this other bendy toy, like I guess something you would sell to kids in like a school supply store. It was like an eraser thing that bent. And she put one of the toys on top of the other one and said like his private part will enter yours. And I didn't know what she was talking about. I had never seen a naked man. And I was like, how, like, the math wasn't making sense in my head. And so she had to do a little more demo and got this douche out from underneath the desk and showed me how, like, the stick on that douche would be like the shape of his private part, and that it would go up and get erect and go into my vagina. I remember just being sick. I wish someone had told me. My wedding was 2 days away at that
Ooh.
point, and it almost felt a little bit intentional that I didn't get that information until 48 hours before. My family had already flown in from all over the world, like, my dress was purchased, like, party planners were hired, everything was set, and that's when I found out what I would have to do, and I didn't really have expectations before then because I didn't know anything. I just knew I was doing something for God, and then I found out. And I know that his groom classes, the man I was engaged to, were similarly vague. It was like 6 weeks of like, this is very holy. And then right before the wedding, it was like, here's how you have sex, and you have to do it to consummate your marriage. And so neither of us were really given the benefit of learning about consent
Mhm.
or even learning about like how to assess how the other person is doing that much in that situation. We were just educated to do what we needed to do for God.
Yeah. And especially where you're having these feelings towards a woman, I'm sure you're completely not wanting to enter into this at all with this man that you don't even really know.
I think because I was with her and I was so in love with her and it felt so good to be near her, I think part of me might have just completely blocked out the idea that I would have to touch a man altogether.
Also, one thing that I want everyone to understand, and I would like you to explain it, is how the rabbi is essentially in bed with you. You
Yeah.
have to call and ask him things, you had to tell him, "Did it happen?" "Well, I don't know," and he's talking about finger distances, and I was like, "What is happening here?" Can you explain that whole situation?
So I end up in this hotel room with my husband, who was like actually very shy. He was a very shy man. He was just like, "Oh, okay, we have to do this thing. Are you ready?" And he knew it would hurt me. Like, we learned that
Mm.
it would hurt to break my hymen because I was still a virgin. And he was like, I know I have to hurt you, but I don't, are you okay? So he wasn't really being, I know not all men are like this, but to his credit, I didn't feel like he was trying to take advantage of the situation. I felt like he was genuinely trying to do the holy thing. But we couldn't really figure out how to have sex for a few days because we didn't know what we were doing. And he was like, where is like, I remember him being like, is that your belly button? Like, he didn't know what happened
Oh
underneath
my
the belly button.
gosh. Oh, no. Bless
And I
him.
was, yeah, like, he was so kind of naive, like, I really can't even blame him. He was like, "What do I do?" So I'm, like, trying to help him, and then after a few days, we're like, "We think maybe something happened." Like, we might have made contact. I don't know. Maybe there was penetration, but we have no idea what's going on. So we have to call the rabbi and be like, because the moment we would have consummated our marriage and had sex, different rules applied.
Okay.
It's like at that moment, my hymen would have broken, I would have bled, and then we wouldn't be able to touch each other for 2 weeks until I immersed in a ritual bath. So it was important, according to the law, that we know when it happened. But since we didn't know, we had to call the rabbi. And I remember talking to the rabbi, and he's trying to talk to me about, did I have sex with my husband? He's like, were you able to fit fingers between you and your husband's body? How many fingers were you able to fit? I guess trying to assess how deep did his penis penetrate me? And was it deep enough?
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, what? Like, fingers? Like, why am I like, I didn't even know, these are not words I wasn't allowed to say penis or vagina or sex. So it was like this game of charades. Which is
A game of charades. Did you have language for that? Did you understand the anatomy as far as penis, vagina? Did you have understanding of that before the class?
I understood my anatomy to some extent because I needed to like go to the gynecologist and get checked out and put on birth control
Okay.
in order to time my period so I wouldn't be bleeding at the wedding.
Oh,
I didn't know much. I didn't know about sexual pleasure.
okay.
I didn't know. I just knew like this is where tampons go in and where like babies come out of.
Got it. And it seems like he didn't have any understanding of the female anatomy.
I think, yeah, he did not.
Okay, so the rabbi said you didn't have sex. Try again.
Basically, yeah. But the rabbi had to call like my bride teacher. It was like a whole like, and then we had to try again. Eventually, it hurt enough that I knew like something more
Hmm.
had happened, and we did manage to do it.
Just that in itself is really heartbreaking because sex doesn't have to hurt even the first time. I know
Yeah.
that's a huge possibility for a lot of women, but it doesn't have to if you know what you're doing, if you know that you can become aroused, if you know that you should wait a certain amount of time for foreplay or whatever it is that feels right for you. That's what's so heartbreaking is you're both dreading this act because you're accepting pain or you're waiting for the pain when it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then it adds a whole layer in your case where you don't even want to be pleasured by this man because you're uninterested. So all of that together is just a lot, and I'm sorry that you had to go through that.
Thank you.
Yeah, especially just having this other random man involved in your personal affairs and calling around. It just how did that make you feel knowing that everyone was involved in this sexual matter between you and your husband?
It really made me feel like my body no longer belonged to me.
Yeah,
I completely disconnected from my body, and I almost didn't want to think about any of it. I was just like, this body is a vessel for God, and it's just simply not mine anymore.
right. Do you feel like your husband treated it that way as well? Did he have any urge to connect? Did it feel like he wanted to connect in a different way other than just transactional?
He, I think, did. Like, he was a straight man. So I think when we did have sex, he felt close to me.
Mhm.
And on some level, he later admitted that he wanted more warmth from me. Well, like during our sexual encounters, I would just sort of lie there and take it. Like I would just lie down and wait for him to be done. And at some point later in our marriage, he said, like, I wish she would hug me.
Mm.
So I think he did have a little more of a closeness feeling.
Yeah, and in that part of your book, you're like, "Was I supposed to move? No one told me I was supposed to move." And then
Yeah.
you mentioned, "Well, I moved with her." And I thought that was so telling because that instinct, that desire, that drive was there for somebody else, but when you're in this marriage, you're like, "No one told me," because everything is so by the book. You have rules for everything. So I could see how that felt confusing of, well, that wasn't part of the bridal class. How was I
Yeah.
supposed to know?
Oh my god. Yeah, yeah, and I felt so guilty, like, I felt like I ruined it for myself because I
Oh.
really, like, touched this girl, and I really liked it, and I was like, "Oh, now like, I screwed myself here. I shouldn't have done that."
Yeah, that was another really heartbreaking part of your book, and if you're comfortable talking about it, I'd like to talk about the shame and the guilt around something that you shouldn't have felt ashamed for, which was your first pregnancy.
Oh, yeah. So I got pregnant, like, very soon after my wedding, and I was so happy to be pregnant. It was like, that would be the prize. I was gonna do all these things for God, and in return, I would have a child. I loved that idea of like nurturing a child. I knew I could be a good mom, and I just wanted my own little baby to love. And after like a couple of weeks, I remember being like 5 weeks pregnant and going to get a blood test because I needed to know. And the doctor was like, nobody comes in at this point, and it was positive. I was pregnant. But then a few days later, maybe a week and a half later, we were at my husband's parents' house for Shabbat, which is this 24-hour period where we're not supposed to use electricity. And I started to bleed. And I told him in like my stilted little language that I had for what was even happening in my body he knew I was pregnant. I said, I'm having some spotting. And he decided that I shouldn't go to the doctor or the hospital because we weren't allowed to use the phone that day. It was Saturday.
Mm.
And so I just like kind of clamped my thighs together and prayed through the day and hoped that maybe me listening to him would be enough to make everything go okay. But later that night after sundown, we went to the ER and I found out that I had lost the baby. I'd been bleeding all day and I lost the baby. I felt so little. I was 19 years old, like in a New Jersey ER with this doctor just looking at me like with such pity, seeing my age on the chart, and seeing that I was in a wig and a long skirt and pregnant, and just telling me that I lost the baby. And I almost thought I deserved it. I thought, like, I did such bad things with my private parts. I felt things for this girl before I got married. I was still thinking about her and missing her. And I thought, okay, like, God is taking this from me, and this is my punishment, and I'm just going to have to accept it. And it was also like a warning, like, I cannot think about her anymore.
Wow. Just the agony you must have been going through, one, just losing a child, but then blaming yourself for that. I can't imagine how that must have felt for you. And like you said, you're so young and you're just trying to block everything out and do the Lord's will and be the best person that you can be in God's eyes. And you feel like you're failing. And wow, that must have been so incredibly difficult.
I think it just turned me into this, like, kind of sculpture of ice. Like, I couldn't handle it. And I just was like, I'm going to just keep driving forward, do what I need to do, and not think or feel anymore.
Yeah. Can you talk about the rules around the miscarriage? In your book, you talked about how, well, it depends on the gender, and I wondered what that was about.
Okay, I think theoretically it's something like this. Girl fetuses have eggs inside of them, so they will eventually menstruate and like have the ability to reproduce. And so have giving birth or passing a miscarriage of a female baby would involve waiting for the amount of days to purify oneself for that birth, plus the amount of days like to honor the fact that this is a girl that also could have reproduced, and to purify oneself for the potential of that future reproduction. This doesn't make any, how do you feel hearing this? Because this is like batshit to explain
Well, it's kind
right
of a
now.
lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
I like now I'm a therapist. I'm in New York, it's like I'm talking about this and I'm like, this sounds insane. Yeah. It's insane. But I think that's like kind of what it was about. So when you have a miscarriage, when someone has a miscarriage and it's a girl baby, you have to count more days before you dunk in a ritual bath and are deemed pure again.
Okay. Which there's also another set of rules that surround that, and your husband took those to the extreme, which I was happy that I think it was your bridal teacher was saying, hey, that's not normal. He's taking things a step greater where he wouldn't even look at
Yeah.
you. Can you talk about what that was like?
Yeah. So there are these rules for when a woman is menstruating or bleeding for any reason that are designed to protect a couple from having sex. And so the rules are like, if I wanted to pass something to him, I would have to put it down and he would pick it up. So no touching, even as a brushing in passing, no cuddling, no kissing, no sleeping in the same bed, no sitting on the same sofa cushion. It would have to be separated. And all of that is so that you don't feel tempted to have sex. My husband was very devout, and so he decided he would basically avoid looking at me altogether during those weeks of impurity because he was afraid that if he looked at me, potentially I would have like one strand of hair loose from my wig or something, or maybe my shirt would ride up above my elbow, and that those things would cause him to become uncontrollably aroused.
Mm,
And so he would just sort of mumble in my direction.
that must have felt incredibly lonely.
Yeah. It also like contributed to me feeling so objectified.
Yeah.
Like oh, you only want to talk to me when you can have sex with me, and then the rest of the time, I'm still doing your laundry. I'm still dealing with the after effects of maybe being impregnated by you. I'm cooking you meals. And what am I at that point? Nothing.
Right, a vagina who can cook,
Yeah.
in your words.
Yeah. That's exactly what it felt like.
Even though while you're giving birth, so you did become pregnant again and you're in the hospital about to give birth, and even then he felt like he couldn't look at you. That to me was really shocking as someone who gave birth 7 months ago. I can't even imagine my husband not being in the room there with me, helping me, holding me, pushing me through it, and you still had to be covered in some ways. You said you had your long skirt on under your hospital gown?
Yeah.
What was that like?
I was so scared. I gave birth for the first time when I was 20 years old. And I was by myself, like just alone in a hospital room. He refused to even be in the room. And I have a complicated family history. I didn't have a mother who could be with me. She had some history of mental illness. And so I remember being terrified, just terrified. I couldn't, there was just no one to lean on. And I was also taught like not really to connect with or trust outsiders so much. So like everyone in the room was a secular person, a regular like American person who wasn't Orthodox. So there was like also this barrier between me and the medical professionals around me.
How come your sisters couldn't be there with you?
I think that mainly because just they had so many kids of their own.
Okay.
They were so overburdened. One of my sisters has 10 children.
Wow.
And then like the next one has 8 and 6. And so if they were going to leave their families every time someone gave birth, like no one would ever be home for their kids. Yeah.
Yeah, which is also something that I wanted to talk about. So, this inability to control when you could have children or if you were able to put a pause on that. So, birth control was a big theme in the early part of your book. So, let's talk about the rules around that.
Yes. It's still hard, it's kind of hard to think that I actually went through that sometimes, that I was forced to get pregnant, even though my kids are like much older now. It just hits more and more over time in a way, as my children are now the age that I was when this happened to me. My
Mm.
son is 19 and a half now, and that's how old I was when I was pregnant with him, and he's going to college. But when I was his age, I had him, I gave birth to him. I loved him so much. He was so sweet. He was just like this tiny little blue-eyed, pokey little baby. And then 6 months later, my rabbinic permission for birth control expired. They give you like 6 months after you have a baby. And so I went back to the rabbi with my husband and begged for more time because I was trying to get a master's in social work. I had a tiny baby. I felt like my organs weren't even like back in the places they were supposed to be in yet. Like you're
Yeah.
right at that point where it's like, I don't like I'd never seen my breasts get so big and then so small and then like
Yeah.
everything still hurt.
Yep.
My
I'm right there.
skin wasn't like my skin was like still like the stretch marks, like it was just a mess. I didn't think I would ever fit into clothes again. Like I was tired, exhausted from taking care of a tiny newborn.
Mhm.
And my birth control permission had run out. And so I went to the rabbi with my husband, but the rabbi didn't even talk to me. He didn't even look at me. He didn't even want to engage with me. He asked my husband, does she have a medical problem? And that was the only way I would have gotten an excuse to use birth control for longer. Unfortunately, I was healthy. And so he said, well, you can't, your time is up. And about 2 weeks later, I was pregnant again.
Oh.
And so my children are 15 months apart because literally at the 6 month mark is when I got pregnant with my next one.
Right, that's a lot on your body, especially when you're not ready for it. mentally or physically. I'm in that position now where I'm like, oh God, please don't help me. Don't let me get pregnant right now because I'm not ready. Everything
Yeah.
just feels out of whack. I'm just trying to get back to where I was before I got pregnant. So I can imagine how you must have felt getting right back on that hamster wheel of pregnancy.
And like being exhausted, right? Like it's so much to take care of a baby through the night.
Yeah.
And you don't get time off. You can't really like just go for a walk if you want to.
Yeah. Something that I've found, and we probably should have said this way at the beginning, that yes, we are talking about ultra Orthodox Hasidic communities, but each one has their own little variances. So we're not trying to make blanket statements across anyone else's experience. We're just talking specifically about Sarah's. What I've noticed in other interviews is that generally speaking, the women are the ones who work and then the men study. And so, who takes care of the kids, or what was that like for you?
Yes, yes, and that's a really good point. This was an ultra Orthodox sect of Judaism. And there are different sects that function much, much, much differently. My husband was supposed to study and learn Torah and Bible studies all day, and I was supposed to be the one who brought home income. And so I was given permission to go outside of the community to social work school. I had wanted to get a PhD, which was very rebellious for like where I was coming from. But after my marriage, his rabbi said, you can't do that, but you can get a master's degree. And so I was allowed to like sneak into a car with other women from the community and go to Rutgers University in New Jersey one day a week and get a master's in social work. And the expectation was that I would support him. Like I would bear the children, I would continue to raise them and have them, and also hold down the job.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. I will say though, the community is set up for that. The babysitters just operate around the hours of the Bible study schedule. So it's like the men would go to Bible study from 10 to 2 and then from 5 to 8 or whatever every day. So like the babysitters would go from 10 to 2. So the woman could go to work, husband could drop off the kids at 10, pick them up at 2, watch them until the wife came back. It was kind of like there was a system and a culture that was warm and supportive around these expectations in many ways.
Yeah. So, who were these babysitters?
Just women from the community, not, I don't know how many were licensed or whatever, but just like other moms who would say you can drop them off at my place. And it was part of what like makes it hard to leave communities like this. Yes, the mission you're given is hard. And also, there's so much warmth and love and support. It's like this enclave where everyone's on the same path and the same mission.
Hmm. Which is important to talk about because it's not all negative, of course. If it
Yeah.
were, no one would belong to any of these groups, right? There has to
Yeah.
be something that keeps people there. I just find it so interesting that being a mother and having as many children as possible to raise in the ways of the Lord as they see fit is so important, yet the woman is expected to go and work. It seems like it would be the opposite where they expect the woman to stay home and have the man do all the working so that she could focus on the kids. It seems like a lot to put on one woman's plate, especially if you're having 10 children.
It really is. It is a lot. And I guess I can't really defend that. you know, so I eventually opted out.
Right. So I did want to talk about your education because that seemed, like you said, not common for women in the Hasidic community to want higher education. And you were so interested in becoming a psychologist or was it psychiatrist? Psychologist.
Psychologist, yeah.
Yeah. And I want to talk about why you had those passions, talk a little bit about the way mental health is viewed in the community with your sister and your mother, and how that rug was pulled right from under you once you got married.
So I was taken to my first therapy session when I was 7 years old. And it was like this play therapist in New York. And I remember thinking, this guy does not know what he's doing. It was like, I remember him telling everything I told him to my mother. And I was like, wait, don't you realize are you not analyzing me enough to see I'm really uncomfortable sharing things with my mother? So that experience was informed by my mother being this generation post-Holocaust. She was born like in Germany in 1946 in a displaced persons camp, just right off the Holocaust. She had so much trauma and so much anxiety, saw demons everywhere, and struggled to raise kids, just struggled with life, everything. And then I had this sister who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 7. And so she went away to a psych unit and then to recovery centers that I wasn't aware of or informed about. And so I missed her and I wasn't really told where she was. She just disappeared. But what they did do was take me to this therapist. And so from this young age, I knew kids need someone better than this. Like kids like me need someone who can understand them and who they can actually talk to and trust. Someone who can read between the lines of what they're saying. That's when I developed my passion for helping people speak the unspoken.
Mm.
Because I understood I don't know how to say all the things that are happening around me. But I hope someone could just see through that and see me, like see what I'm going through. That person I was taken to was a psychologist, and I was like, I want to be a better psychologist. And I kept that dream up through my like Orthodox Jewish education. I did talk to my rabbi, someone I was close with. In the book, he's called Rabbi Levi. And all names have been changed because I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable by putting them in my book. And he had said, I understand your dream. And I think you're one of those people who's faithful enough to go out in the world and go to college and come back to us and bring your gifts home to the community. And I spoke with my husband about that when we were dating. And I said, my rabbi agrees. I really want to be a psychologist. I was applying to PhD programs. And he just nodded. Like we were eating Chinese food. I remember we were at a restaurant in upstate New York in Muncie. And I think he was eating some kind of noodle. And like we're just eating. I'm like all nervous to say this thing. And he just like wiped his mouth and was like nodded. So I'm like, okay, great. He nodded, like, I believe you. And then very shortly after we got married is when he had his rabbi sort of like give this message to me in a conversation that I was not a part of. And I just received a message. You don't need a PhD. You can just do a master's in social work. And that just further made me feel really trapped. It was like I knew I was giving my body to God. I was prepared to give my body to God. But I wasn't prepared to give up everything that made me me.
Yeah.
And in that moment, it was like, oh, I actually don't even matter enough to be a part of the conversations that determine my own future. I'm irrelevant altogether.
Right. And this is by design. It seems like, from an outsider's perspective, one of the other quotes in your book was, a kosher woman does the will of her husband. That moment you realized, well, that's it. His say is the final say. I can't argue this. I can't even give a reason why I think it should be different. That's the end of it.
Exactly. And I'd been primed for that moment, right? Because I'd been primed to like a year of study in seminary, which is a school for preparing you for marriage. I'd been primed to believe that I would need to do what my husband said. So when he said something that felt devastating to me, I didn't have any way to like sort of fight back.
Mm-hmm.
To do so would have been to be inviting God's wrath, to be rebellious, to be potentially bringing misfortune upon my family.
Oh, and with that in mind, and I want to get back to the education, but that scene just popped up in my head about how you didn't even have the ability to ask for certain medication during your second delivery for Pitocin to speed along the delivery of your baby. You had to sit in pain because the rabbi wouldn't give permission. That to me, it blows my mind that even in the moment of a woman's potentially greatest pain, she can't even have autonomy over how she gives birth.
I remember being so conflicted because at that point I was in social work school and I worked on an inpatient unit in Toms River, like in a psychiatric hospital. I was a social work intern pregnant with my second child in my full garb. And my colleague, Madison, wore like these tight fitted t shirts and she had a growing baby belly and her hair was just in a ponytail. She was a social worker on the unit. She was so comfortable in her skin. Like, I remember her pregnancy just looking so cool, and mine was so repressed under these layers of garb. And she had a birth plan. And I listened to her. Like, I remember standing at the nurse's station, we're like filling out patient charts in the psych unit. And she's like, "Yeah, I think I maybe want to give birth in a pool. And I have a playlist. And here's like," it was like 2005. So she was like, "I have a mixed CD." It was like back then. And whatever her husband's name was like, and Jack wants to hold my hand through it, but then he'll only let go to cut the cord. And I am looking at her and like feeling so jealous that this woman has a plan, but I'm trained and conditioned to say, "You're an idiot. It's God's plan. You can't control any of this." So I'm like trying to judge her, but like my heart is feeling complete envy at
Yeah.
the same time. And so that carried through to my moment of labor where I was in the hospital in my like headscarf, in my skirt, in the gown, and giving birth to my daughter. And I had gotten an epidural. Like, I decided on an epidural. I hadn't done one the first time. And I was like, I have had enough pain for this year. I need an epidural. So I was allowed to do that. But then when you have an epidural, it slows your labor. And so oftentimes they'll just do an epidural and a drug to keep your labor going, Pitocin. But my husband didn't want to bother the rabbi and ask if I could do that. I just was strapped to a bed, like into all the monitors and everything. I needed a catheter through the entire long night, on and off in labor, with the epidural wearing off
Ugh.
and without permission to progress. And I think at that point, I just felt like, I don't know, like a stuffed pig or something. Like no one really seemed to care. Even the medical staff in the hospital, I think they were so trained to know that women like me who came in from the nearby town, we were just different. We weren't like gonna have the same luxuries and courtesies and rights that other women had. So
Mm,
they were sort of like used to it. They didn't even seem to be surprised or upset. I was scared, but I was also just like resigned
yeah.
and numb.
What would you have wanted to be different if you could go back and say something to the staff? Or if you have any advice for hospital staff or medical staff who may come across someone like you? You just said that they tended to just make blanket statements across the board for everyone who comes in and not really advocate. Would you have wanted them to advocate for you more?
The message I would have to hospital, and that's such a good question, is don't assume anything and give women choices. Even women who look religious often have different feelings and thoughts on the inside.
Right.
So when I had said, like, "Oh, I need to wait for the rabbi to give me permission to take this medication," it would have been cool if a nurse had come up to me and said, like, when no one was around, and said, "By the way, if you want me to just start it for you, I can. No one needs to know."
Mhm.
Things like that. I remember, like, the doctor, after I gave birth to my daughter, I had this, like, rip in my vagina, this skin tag, and I remember him looking at it and saying, "Oh, this is, like, something that went wrong," and he said, "Oh, we'll just close it up next time you give birth." He just assumed that I would continue to have babies, that whatever was going
Right.
on didn't matter, and that he would just close it up next time, and I wish he had said, "Do you want me to take care of this now?
Yeah.
Or would you rather wait for if you choose to have another child, this is something we can fix during delivery," right? But because like I was in a community where choice was not valued, it was almost like the medical staff like gave up on us, gave up on me. They didn't give me the options I think that they could have.
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about the full scope of that because not even just in medical staff, but anywhere out in the world, I think it's important for people to understand where their head is at within these communities and their limitations and their boundaries, but to know that, like you said, they may want something different. Maybe they don't. Maybe they're perfectly happy and content living within those boundaries, but maybe there is someone like you who would have benefited from a little extra compassion and care. I want to talk more about your college experience because I think it also really shows those boundaries to the point of you needing to walk out of a class because you think something is going to harm your unborn child. So let's talk about those things that you're learning in college that are opening your mind a little bit, expanding your mind, and maybe that rabbi wasn't completely correct in the sense that you'll still come back even after everything you learn in college because it
Yeah.
seemed like you're like, well, wait a second, there's a lot out here that I'm really leaning towards.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, college was right. Yeah, they said like, don't go to college, it'll ruin you. And it did. It ruined me to like the purity of religion for sure.
Yeah, so those classes, let's talk about some of those things. So the class where you were learning about gay rights, I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. I had been at college, I started hearing about this idea that gay people like do exist and there are places in the world where that does happen. I learned about the Stonewall riots during a social practice, like a social work practice class. And I also learned about HIV, which was scary to me to learn about. And what I would do with that information is I would put it into a pre existing schema that I already had. So the idea I had was being any sort of gay is a sin and you will get punished. Right. And so when I learned about HIV, I was like, and AIDS, I was like, there's the punishment.
Mm.
It just confirmed my pre existing biases because those were so strong. But then there was this class I was in where the professor just like without warning put on this film about gay rights. It was like sweet and musical and loving, and I could see women like kissing other women and holding hands, and it was like sunshine, rainbow, sparkle kind of film, and I wasn't prepared to see that. I was prepared to learn about the hardships of being gay, and like that worked for me. But seeing the joy, like queer joy, trans joy, that felt really threatening to me. And I felt very worried that I would fall back into this like kind of sinful path. And so I asked to leave the class so I wouldn't have to see it.
Right.
Just like how strong that brainwashing goes.
Right. And I forget the name of the other Orthodox woman who was there with you. She was worried
Sigma, yeah.
about your unborn child.
Right. Like she saw me. So we're sitting in this class and the film is on and I'm starting to go like this, like cover my face. And she was like, "Psst, like, you're pregnant. You can't be here for this." With this like really strong idea that if I watch something and it's impure, like my child would be impure. The purity culture is so pervasive.
Yeah, that's next level right there.
Yeah.
That what you are watching is going to infect your unborn child. That, yeah, I underlined when I was reading your book. I was like, whoa, that's a lot. That's a lot to take in. That's a lot of pressure for you
It
as a
was.
pregnant woman.
Yeah. I mean, my daughter, who I was pregnant with, she's turning 18 this month and she's bisexual. And she always says, it's because you walked out in the middle of the film. She's like, Mom, if you would have just stayed to the end, who knows?
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. I love that humor. Okay, so is there anything else, any other defining moments at college that really piqued your interest in the outside world or got you thinking more critically?
I think there was like a moment when I learned that marital rape like the term marital rape, that was really scary for me to learn because it was like, wait, I didn't know that could happen within the context of a marriage.
Mm.
And I started to think about all the times my husband, he would come home at the end of his night of learning, and I would be on the couch trying not to look up, reading one of the limited Jewish magazines I was allowed to read. So I'd be just like pretending to be engrossed in the magazine I had already read 50 times. And I didn't want him to ask for sex because I believed that the moment he asked, it was my duty to provide.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, like, if I read this hard enough, he'll just walk by me. But every night when the doorknob rattled, I would get so scared and frozen. And he would come in, and again, he was a gentle guy, right? Like, it's just that that's what I thought the rule was, that I couldn't say no. And he would say, in this Hebrew word tashmish, which is like Hebrew for, do you want like sex? And I would have to put the magazine down. It's what I believed I had to do, and follow him to the bedroom and lie there while he, on some level, like just, I don't know, I don't want to say like rape, but it was a little rapey. It's like the Handmaid's Tale kind of scene. Like I just laid there while he took whatever he wanted to take that day. And hearing the word marital rape made me really think about that.
Wow. Something that I wanted to ask you, if this was the same in your sect, Beatrice had mentioned that she was, I don't know if it was a rule or she was under the impression that men were supposed to pleasure the women or make sure that they were pleasured. Was that in your space at all? Was that a rule?
I mean, I think it was technically a rule. It's written in the marriage contract, like the man needs to satisfy his wife sexually.
Okay.
But there's no real follow-up to that, and there's no instruction on how to do that.
Okay. Yeah.
So I know in my husband's case, he was told you should have about 45 minutes of foreplay before you enter the woman.
Uh-huh.
But he wasn't told like what constituted foreplay. So he was a very literal man, and he would put like a timer on, and he would like stroke my arm for 45 minutes.
No, Sarah. Sarah. Stop. Okay.
He was just so like kind of in a way like so sweet and like such a rule follower. He was like, they said
Mm.
45 minutes.
The intention
And
was there,
it was
just
there.
missed the
It
mark.
was. Right. Like if you say pleasure a woman, but then there's no follow-up and you've never seen a woman, like, it doesn't really
The
count.
dots don't connect. Right, because you had mentioned there was something on campus about female orgasm, and you're like,
Yeah.
that's a funny word. What does that mean?
Right. I was like, it probably means the same thing as like MTV, like things I'm not supposed to know about.
Right.
There are so many. How would I even know what they were?
Yeah. Okay, so we need to get to the point of your story, and thank you for being so candid about all of this sex stuff. I think it's so important. When you finally decided, I don't feel safe here, you told him to get out of the house and you started the process of trying to get a divorce. Can you explain to people who aren't familiar how you actually get a divorce within your community?
Yes. So the divorce process within the Orthodox and Hasidic community is very stacked toward the male. The husband has the right to decide whether or not he grants a divorce to his wife. And that's a Jewish divorce, not a civil divorce, a Jewish one. It's important for women and men in the community to have a Jewish divorce because they cannot remarry another Jewish person without it. And if they do, then their children get shunned and they get excommunicated. So it's an important
Whoa.
document to have. And that's like the stakes are high, right? And so when I wanted to get divorced, I needed my husband's permission to get a divorce. And I knew that he could decide whether or not to give one to me. And also, divorce is viewed as a terrible thing to do, like in many religious cultures, as against what God wanted. And so I started making my rounds to the rabbis to get permission to pursue a divorce. And each rabbi like acted like it was the first time I'd ever made a complaint, and we're like, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? Try this marriage counselor, etc. And I realized it wasn't getting anywhere. I could have made the rounds of rabbis for 10 years, and many women do. And they're told, like, oh, just wait, because no rabbi wants the responsibility of saying, I have given this couple permission to get divorced. And so eventually I got creative and I made threats. And that's how I got my divorce. But I threatened my husband's parents, and it was like, subtly in a very sweet voice, I was like, I don't really want to have to tell anyone that he was abusive. And that worked. They told him to grant the divorce, but he did get to put a condition in the divorce document. I was just so grateful that he was going to let me go. And so when he asked me to sign something that said I pledged and promised that I would raise my kids Orthodox, the language of that document says, and if I were to deviate, custody of my children would be transferred to him.
Mm.
That means if I were to deviate from like not wearing a wig, long skirts, praying, being part of the Orthodox community, keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat, if I were to deviate, be gay, I would lose my kids. And I signed it because I was just so grateful to get out. And I was like, you know what? I'm not losing my kids. And so I will do whatever I have to do. I'll wear the garb, I'll do the orthodoxy. It doesn't matter. I just can't be married to him, but I'll do that for them.
Yeah. And that's a really big sacrifice for you because I think mentally you were on your way out, but I'm sure you were just thinking one step at a time. I just
Yeah,
gotta get this thing handled first. And your kids were still really young, right?
they were 3 and 1, and I was 24.
Mm,
So I felt very powerless.
yeah. Your trip to, was it Miami? No, no, no.
Aruba.
Aruba?
Yeah.
Aruba. Yes, I was cheering for you when you put a bikini on and just
Yeah.
tried to exist in society in a different way. Let's talk about that. How did it feel for those who haven't read your book yet? How did it feel to be so exposed and to realize that everyone wasn't staring at you in the way that you had expected?
It was so surreal. Like snuck away to Aruba for 3 short days. I packed my kosher food and this Victoria's Secret like red triangle bikini that had like all these strings, and that came in this little like plastic, the little plastic bags of like. I remember being in Aruba and taking my wig off and trying to figure out what to do with the bikini. And like we're like it had like a halter tie. It was like so complicated. It's so complicated to tie a bikini on yourself, especially if you've never done it. And I remember like looking at my body. I'm like, I don't even know. Like I hadn't really looked at my body in so many years. And I saw like these like stretch marks from childbirth, and everything was just sort of not the same as I remembered it from before. So it had been so many years since I really, really like was in my body. But then when I went down to the beach and like I was out in a bikini, I was taught that like I would immediately get sexually assaulted, right? Like that was my upbringing. You can't show a man as much as your elbow because they can't control themselves.
Mhm.
But I was on the beach in my like post childbearing like pale white body with marks, with my red bikini, and like no one even really gave a shit. They just like looking back, I'm like, there's so many other things to look at on a beach that rather than like my like 24-year-old self. And I was like really, really shocked that no one looked at me. But then after like a little while, like an hour, I just remember feeling like warm down to my bones. Like I felt like that ice cold that I had developed from being so frozen and numb through my marriage, it was starting to thaw. And I felt like the sun was truly like on my skin, warming me. And that felt amazing.
Yeah. I think it's really important to point out here that we're not saying the only way to freedom or the only way to feel good and feel the sun is to be in a bikini. And we're not saying that being modest is bad. We're talking about the freedom of choice and the
Mhm.
dissolution of fear. I think that's the biggest theme here throughout your book is being afraid to stand up for yourself, being afraid to own your sexuality, being afraid to dress the way that you wanted, to get the career that you wanted, to be who you wanted to be. And that moment of being in a red bikini and soaking up the sun is such a beautiful illustration of just letting everything melt off of you, of just being yourself for once in your life, and you're just 24 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
So after that, Let's talk about what happened because you do have to uphold this standard in order to keep your children. That's a huge threat and something that you talk about in the book. What if there was just by chance someone in Aruba who happened to see you, everything would be gone and taken away. So you still do have that underlying fear of needing to conform, needing to fit into that box to keep your children. So how did you move forward?
So I wanted to squeeze some life in while I was 24. I really wanted to explore the entire world. And during the hours that I didn't have my children, where they were with their father or with a babysitter, I left the community. I would get into my car. It was like a old Buick, and I would throw my wig into the back seat and just try to figure out something to do with my hair. I didn't really know how to do my hair because I had been covering it for so long. I would swipe on eyeliner while I was driving and pull on some jeans. I remember like these Target ripped jeans I had that I thought were so great. Like they fit so well. I left them at my ex-boyfriend's house because he was toxic and I didn't want to get them back. But I dated toxic men and like went and like hooked up with women, went to strip clubs, went like to casinos, bars, and drank and like experimented and had fun and did some dangerous things too, like drank too much, around strangers. But then in the morning, I would always put the garb back on, put the wig back on, wipe the makeup off, and go back into this like virginal looking female person that looked like I hadn't done or experienced any of that.
Yeah.
And so I did that for a little while, like a year or two. And it was stressful. And also, like, I was financially really stressed at that time. Like, my family support was waning because I wasn't really doing what they wanted me to do. They didn't know what I was doing, but like, it was clear I wasn't married to a Jewish man. And so I ended up remarrying another Jewish man. And he loved me and he was a sweet guy who wasn't as orthodox and he knew like about the side of me that loved women. At that point, I wasn't admitting to myself that I was gay. Like I thought maybe I was bi, I could still be with a man.
Mm-hmm.
And so he loved me and knew that about me. And so I married him and did that for another 5 years.
5 years, yeah. How were you feeling then? Because it seems like emotionally he may have been meeting your needs in a way that felt better for you, but were you still craving or feeling like something was missing there?
Yeah. Yeah. There's this moment in the book where it was like 2 weeks before I was about to commit to being with him. And I went to the West Village in New York City. I pulled out my jeans out of the back of the closet and I told myself I was going to give myself one more night just to be free. And I found myself in a lesbian bar and everything was intoxicating. Every single thing. I wanted to just like be there forever. All the women were so hot. I wanted to talk to them. I didn't just want to sleep with them. I wanted to like just like kind of curl up in bed with someone and ask them about their dreams and touch their face. Like I was just so gay. I'm so gay. I'm like, yeah, like tell me what you're thinking about, tell me your deepest fear. Like, let's go for a walk and hold hands and fuck. But like I wanted everything.
Yes.
And I was 26 and I was like, okay, Sarah, this is your last night of this. That's it. And I just forced myself. I was like, you will never ever do this again. You're committing to this man. You get to be here for this one night. I didn't want to kiss anyone. I wanted to, but I chose not to because I was worried that if I did that, I would lose complete control over what I was trying to do. And I just like shoved all the feelings down and went home. And I told myself that was the end. Like I would never, ever just engage in that again. And just like I shut my heart off and married him.
Yeah.
So I knew, like at that time I knew on some level that the marriage wasn't exactly fully aligned with who I was on the inside.
Right. Something you mentioned in the book about the first marriage was how brides basically get this sort of baptism. Once you get married, all your sins are forgiven, you're washed clean, you're new. Does that same thing apply to a second marriage? Did you feel like that was happening again?
Yeah, so it's like when you get married, everything you've done prior to that disappears. It's like a blank slate. Your sins are wiped.
Okay.
So I was like, okay, I did that one thing. I went to the bar, but after I got married, it was like I would get to start fresh. But as many times as I got married, my attraction to women, like that was never wiped away from me. And I kept hoping God would just take it away,
So
you
at
know.
this point, had you spoken to a rabbi about your feelings towards women? And if so, what was their response to that?
I had not. My ex girlfriend, the one I had at 19, had made a phone call about it to a rabbi at one point, like where she was like, if I'm getting like physically close to another girl, like how bad is it? And he said, well, it's not like the worst sin in the world. It's just disgusting. Like God finds it disgusting, which is also like kind of minimizing and gaslighting of the lesbian experience in general, because it's like the gay men, they're the really bad ones because they're having a kind of sex that counts. You lesbians, you're just playing house, like it almost doesn't even matter,
Right.
which makes us think that our experience, like it isn't even real. But he did say, like, if you penetrate each other with something like a cucumber, then that's really, really, really bad. And I was
Jeez.
like, what cucumber? Like, what exactly would we be doing with a cucumber? I had never seen like a dildo or even a penis at that point. So I just didn't understand like the meaning of cucumber,
Yeah.
you know? So that was like the extent of my rabbinic instruction. I mean, either way, yeah, I wouldn't recommend anyone penetrate anyone with a cucumber. It
Yeah,
sounds
please don't. Don't do
unhygienic.
that.
Don't do that. Do not try that at
Don't
home.
do yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, I think it's important to note that you had no context, like you weren't watching movies, you weren't watching television, you had no idea.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, because at least in other parts of the world or different communities, we have context clues, right? I grew up Mormon. I didn't have sex ed either, really. It was very minimal. I knew that we just weren't supposed to touch or whatever for they said no heavy petting. I'm like, okay, whatever that means. But at least we had movies where we could kind of put
yeah.
things together. So, what at what point did you realize I can't be in this marriage either? I'm definitely gay and this isn't working for me?
So what happened was, without like spoiling, is that I experienced a very severe loss of someone I loved very, very much. And it made me realize that life was finite
Mm,
and that we all were going to die one day. And that, like, from that moment on, I just knew I needed to be true. I didn't want to live my entire life as a lie, as someone who is hiding. And at the same time, I was treating women and men in the community. I had gotten my PhD, I was a psychologist, I had a private practice. And I saw so many people in the community living double lives, which was such a bizarre experience. It's like these kids would come in to see me and they would tell me how they were breaking certain rules. And then the parents would come in to see me and say, my kids don't know this, but here are some rules we're breaking. And I'm like, your kid knows, on some level, your kid knows you're all in the same house, breaking some rules behind doors instead of living your truth as a family. And I just saw the secrets, like how insidious it was for kids to grow up with these narratives they were just lies, like there were so many people were using their phone on Shabbat, for example. And it was just like an unspoken, like the kids would be like, oh gosh, I can't go on WhatsApp because like my status will show that I was active. But their parents were like, I think my kid might have seen my, like, it's like, and why are you all hiding in your bedroom and not talking about it?
Mm-hmm.
And then there were other things that were hidden that were bigger things like mental illness or queerness. And I saw the pain and the struggle of that. And I had amazing clients who were working toward their own authenticity. And at times were making really complicated choices, to be honest, with the people around them, even though it was so, so scary. And they inspired me. Eventually, like those same people inspired me. And I thought, how can I be here helping you with that if I'm disingenuous?
Right.
And my kids were living like I started seeing that my own children were impacted too. The education they were receiving was really subpar. So like there were so many things that happened leading up to those years where I finally made the decision to leave.
And at that point, you still had that clause in your original divorce, right? Did you still have to maintain a Hasidic facade to keep your kids?
So I was still maintaining the facade and I still had the kids in Orthodox schools. And so when I got divorced for the second time and I wanted to leave the community and take the kids with me, I had to face a court case with my first ex husband. And so I have a great lawyer who's like Nina in the book. We'll still email each other and it's like, which divorce are we on? Is this divorce A, divorce B? She walked me through all of it and really saved my future and my children's future.
Wow, that's amazing. So it was a success. You came out on top.
It took me 13 years to leave from the moment I got pregnant with my son. Because the moment I got pregnant with my son, I knew that I wasn't going to give him up. And so for 13 years, I denied who I was. I didn't think about things that could have gotten me in trouble, like as much as possible. I gave myself to God. And I just did what I could every single day to build like my education, my ability to support myself, to come closer to some kind of truth. And at the 13-year mark, I was able to afford the team of attorneys it required for me to break free with my children. And that's why I'm speaking. Like, that's why I keep wanting to speak, because I know so many people are stuck. And I hope that people can hear this and know that it is possible to leave.
Yeah.
It is. It's not easy, but it's possible.
Can you explain to people who aren't familiar why it is so difficult, why you have to get so many lawyers, and essentially what you're up against when you leave a Hasidic community?
Yeah, and I think that like for people to go back and watch Beatrice's episode will be really informative because I had people I looked at like Beatrice and like Javi Weisberger, other cases within the community where it was really clear that if you were going to leave, you can lose your children.
Yeah.
The community has like an infinite amount of resources. They have access to attorneys, they have access to funds, they have control over some of the judges in New York. And people like Beatrice like lose their kids and have to leave them behind in the community. And so that makes it a really complicated choice.
It's really heartbreaking how when someone wants to leave, even their own family will turn against them and support the husband or the person who's staying in the community.
Yeah, my family was the same. Like when I told them I was divorcing my first husband, they were inviting him over to their homes for holidays.
Mm,
And I was like by myself, so young and so isolated. So I knew that if I were going to do anything worse than getting divorced, like actually leave, they would absolutely operate against me.
wow. What is your relationship with them now? Do you have one?
I have a relationship with one segment of the family. If you read the book, it's like Mickey and Adam. They're two amazing kids I love very much and see all the time. And my brother in law, Felix, but not with any of my sisters or mother. I just, I'm too far gone for them to accept me now.
Mm,
And I also don't want to force it, because I know that they've been through a lot too. We all have been as a family. And so it's like, I want them to just like kind of not have to worry about their out gay sister coming to disrupt their lives.
Yeah. Well, what's it been like for you now? Now that you did follow your dream, you got the career that you want, you're living your authentic life. Have you found a community, a chosen family that you can be with?
I'm going to give you a real answer because you
Yes.
like have such a real podcast. So after I left the community, I took all my newfound freedom and got my kids into good schools, and then quickly started struggling with addiction
Mm,
because it was so like I was just going through so much loss and fear. And I had a wild few years, fell in love with a woman, um, explored like the gay scene in New York, had some great moments of freedom. But recently, in the last few years, I've gotten sober and I have like this beautiful sober community in New York City. Those are the people I feel like it's like the closest amount of embrace to what the kind of embrace I left behind. People I could just be real with and call and just be like, this was a really shitty day. And they're like, I know, me too. And like, we can just, it's like having sisters almost.
yeah.
So I have that community, and my kids are in college, which is what I fought so hard for them to have the opportunity to be educated. And they're great. They're just great kids. They're funny and smart and amazing. And I have a lot of love in my life now. And I feel really proud. I turned 40 this week.
Oh my
Nice.
gosh.
I know.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. My son is 19 and a half. My daughter will be 18. I also have a 4-year-old
Oh,
that I gave
wow.
birth to like through IVF. I carried him and like the egg of somebody that I loved. We co-parent now. And I'm just proud. Like I'm proud that I made it to 40 and that my house is like, just fun and crazy and wild and always happening. That we're okay.
That's amazing. I do appreciate you being real and honest because it it helps other people who are watching who may be going through something similar, and falling into addiction is something that does happen quite frequently when you don't understand limits, you don't understand baseline, you don't like when all your life you're told just abstinence only, or don't even touch this or you'll die, or this or that. You don't really understand how you can do something in a healthy way or a healthy amount, if that's something you even want to try. And so it's so commonly happens when people leave these groups. They, of course, are curious and want to try things, but they don't understand maybe how to do it in a healthy way, or, life happens. And so I think it's really great that you were honest about that, and it's awesome that you're sober now and you're doing great and it seems like you're thriving. So thank you for sharing.
And that'll be book two. Book two will be about the messy aftermath of leaving a high control group.
Yes.
Because so many people want to see a before and after, but there is a messy middle
Mhm.
and a painful middle. And sometimes that middle goes on for the rest of your life. It's not just before and after. And
Right.
so I'm currently like working on book two about that.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, maybe we can have a follow-up episode and talk more
Yeah,
about
it'll
that
be
because
fun.
yeah, of course, we skipped a whole chunk of
Yeah.
the acclimating and figuring out who you are, and we have a limited amount of time, but I really did want to focus more on the female side of things and the pregnancy and all of that. So, thank you so much for coming on and sharing. It's been fantastic talking with you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, for continuing to raise awareness. And if anybody wants to see like behind the scenes glimpses of my upcoming events or even pictures of my kids and like the personality behind the story, I'm on all socials at Dr. Sara Glass.
Yes, and your website, drsaraglass.com.
Yep. Thank you.
Yes. So we just need your Linda Listen moment, your sassy statement,
Okay.
or something inspirational.
Okay. My Linda Listen is going to be like for anyone who is in a high control group or a religious community, and you're seeing people who seem to not fit in or who are struggling with the rules. You see someone who is like trying to hide their mental illness or forcing themselves to stay in a bad marriage. Don't be a bystander. Speak up. Validate that person's experiences. It might be scary for you, but if you keep shoving people back into closets, if you keep silencing people, if you tell them their truths are not welcome with you, you are perpetuating the cycle of control and of violence and abuse. And it seems scary to be that only person that says, hey, you're not happy in your marriage? You can tell me. You feel like you're not being heard by the rabbi? You can tell me. I know that's scary. But if you don't do that, you're part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Linda, listen, be a safe space for
Yes.
people.
Yeah.
So good. This has been amazing. Thank you so much again. Do you have any other final thoughts before we go?
No, thank you so much. This has been really fun and interesting. I can't wait for this to come out. Thank you.
Yay! Well, if you are watching, guys, make sure to leave those words of encouragement down below for Sara. You can follow her, like we mentioned, at Dr. Sara Glass. The links are always in the description below. We love when you interact with the post. Liking, sharing, of course, helps boost the algorithm. Even if you just leave a little emoji, we really appreciate that. So if you are interested in more videos, we do have a sister channel that's 8 to 10 minutes if you just want shorter clips of things that you may have missed. It's at Cults to Consciousness Clips. Link is in the description. If you want to support, you can become a patron at patreon.com/cults to consciousness. We are working on channel memberships, so keep an eye out for those to launch, and you'll get more benefits here on the YouTube platform. Let's see, merch. We have some merch at cultstoconsciousness.com under the merch tab. And if you like this video, definitely check out these two down below. Make sure you go watch Beatrice's videos, Javi's videos. If you like this one, they're all also fantastic. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious, and be well.